Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Always excited to go deep.
Awesome. Well, today we're tackling a pretty major theory, social identity theory.
SIT. Yep.
SIT, right? It's a big one. Used in all sorts of fields, not just psychology, which is kind of what makes it so fascinating.
It really does have broad applications. I've seen it pop up in everything from sociology and political science to business and marketing.
For this deep dive, we've got a stack of academic articles to dig through, some overviews of key research studies, even a bit of historical context to give us that bigger picture.
Sounds like we're well equipped.
I think so.
Yeah.
So before we get lost in the details, what's our mission for today? What do we really want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I think first and foremost, a solid grasp of what social identity theory is, at its core. What are the main ideas?
Okay, core concepts for sure.
But then we also want to get into the good stuff, the strengths of the theory, what it really helps us explain.
Like, why does this matter?
Exactly, but also no theory is perfect, right? So we want to touch on the criticisms, the limitations of SIT, and who knows, maybe even uncover some surprises along the way.
I love a good surprise. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is social identity? I mean, I've seen the definition, but it can be a bit abstract, right?
You're right, that classic definition from Henri Tajfel, it can sound a bit dry.
It does, kind of textbooky.
He said social identity is about, well, knowing you belong to certain groups. That's pretty straightforward.
Makes sense. We're all part of different groups.
But he also said it's about the emotions and values you attach to that belonging. That's where it gets interesting.
Ah, so it's not just being physically present in a group. It's how you feel about it, the meaning you give it.
Precisely. It becomes part of your self-concept, your sense of who you are. Think about it like being a sports fan.
Okay, I could see that. You're not just passively watching a game.
Right. Your fandom becomes part of you. It influences what you wear, how you talk to your friends, maybe even how you see the world.
And those feelings get even stronger when your team wins. Like, it's a personal victory.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see that link between social identity and self-esteem.
Because your group is doing well, you feel good about yourself, even if you didn't personally score the winning goal.
Exactly. That's the core of SIT, the desire for positive social identity. We want to see our groups in a positive light because it reflects back on us, boosts our own self-esteem.
It's like basking in the reflected glory of the group, even if we haven't done anything ourselves. But why are we like this? How did this theory even come about?
Well, to understand that, we need to go back in time to the world just after World War II.
A pretty dark chapter in human history.
Absolutely. Psychologists were grappling with trying to understand the horrors that had just happened. Nazism, the Holocaust, all this widespread prejudice leading to unspeakable acts.
It makes sense that they were searching for explanations. I mean, how could something like that happen?
Exactly. Some of the early attempts focused on individual flaws, like the idea of frustration aggression, that people lash out when they're frustrated.
Right, or the authoritarian personality, that certain people are just predisposed to prejudice and obedience to authority.
But those theories, they really put that blame on individual bad actors. And what social identity theory did was offer a totally different perspective.
So instead of blaming just a few messed up individuals, it's looking at the bigger picture of how groups influence behavior.
Precisely. It shifted the focus to the incredible power of group dynamics, saying maybe it's not just about a few bad apples. Maybe being part of a group can push people to do things they'd never do on their own.
Okay, that's pretty profound. It's kind of like that idea of mob mentality, where people get caught up in something bigger than themselves and end up doing things they normally wouldn't.
That's a great analogy. And to really test this idea that groups have this power to influence behavior, Henri Tajfel, one of the pioneers of SIT, came up with this ingenious experiment.
Oh yeah, I've heard of this. The minimal group paradigm, right?
That's the one. It was brilliantly simple, really.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do they do?
So they took a group of British schoolboys and divided them into groups based on something totally arbitrary.
Arbitrary, like what?
I think in one study it was whether they preferred the paintings of Klee or Kandinsky.
Wait, seriously? Just art preference. That's all it took to create a sense of us and them.
That's the beauty of it. These weren't real groups with shared histories or strong bonds. They were minimal, almost meaningless.
But I bet that didn't stop the boys from forming those in-group and out-group distinctions.
You're right, and that's what makes the findings so mind-blowing. Even with these flimsy groups, the boys showed a clear preference for their in-group. They were more likely to give rewards to members of their own group, even if it meant the out-group got less.
Wow. So even when the reason for being in a group is almost non-existent, that need to feel good about your group and therefore yourself still kicks in.
It's a powerful demonstration of SIT in action. The mere act of being categorized, even into a group that seems totally random, triggers that desire for positive distinction. We want our group to be better, even if there's no logical reason for it to be.
That's wild. So, okay, if we're all driven to see our groups as superior, what happens when someone finds themselves in a group that's considered less powerful, lower status? Do they just accept it?
That's a great question, and one that SIT helps us understand. It suggests there are a couple of ways people deal with this tension.
Lay 'em on me. What are they?
One is through what's called a social mobility belief system. This is where someone believes they can move between groups.
So they see the boundaries between groups as fluid, not fixed.
Exactly. They might try to pass as a member of a higher status group, distance themselves from the lower status one they're in.
So like trying to climb the social ladder, even if it means ditching your original group.
In a way, yes. But what happens when those boundaries are tougher to cross or when someone doesn't want to leave their group?
Right, because group membership can also be a source of pride and solidarity. Like it's part of who you are.
Exactly. And that's where the social change belief system comes in. Here, people believe the boundaries between groups are pretty much fixed.
They're stuck with their group, so to speak.
In a way, yes. But instead of trying to escape, they focus on changing the group's status as a whole. They might challenge the system, fight for equality, or even redefine what makes their group valuable in the first place.
So instead of abandoning ship, they're working to make the ship better.
Exactly. It's about fighting for recognition, for a more just and equitable system.
Are there real-world examples of this playing out? Like where we can see these different approaches to social identity?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the most powerful examples comes from Tajfel himself. He was Jewish, living in societies where that identity was often stigmatized and even dangerous.
He could have tried to hide his Jewishness, to blend in, assimilate.
He could have, but he chose not to. He embraced his Jewish identity, became a vocal advocate against prejudice and discrimination.
So he went the social change route. He affirmed his identity even when it was difficult.
And in doing so, he helped pave the way for others to do the same.
That's inspiring. It makes you wonder what makes someone choose one path over the other. Why do some people cling tightly to their groups while others try to escape? Does SIT have an answer for that?
That's one of the limitations of the theory. It provides a great framework for understanding how group membership shapes us, but it doesn't really predict which strategy individuals will choose.
So it's more about the big picture of how groups affect us, but it doesn't necessarily zoom in on all those individual factors that influence our choices.
Right, and that's why it's so important to consider things like individual personality, personal experiences, the broader social and historical context. All of those things play a role.
It makes sense. It's never as simple as just the group. What's also interesting is that SIT has been used to explain so much more than just prejudice and conflict. I mean, researchers have applied it to everything from leadership styles to consumer behavior.
It's true. SIT's influence has really spread beyond psychology into all sorts of fields, which speaks to the power of the theory.
It's clearly resonating with people across disciplines. I'm curious, do you have a favorite example of how SIT has been used in a surprising or unexpected way?
Well, there was this fascinating study on a Danish subsidiary operating in England and how something as seemingly simple as language became a tool for all these group identity dynamics to play out.
That makes sense. Language is such a powerful marker of identity.
Exactly. It can be used to include or exclude, to signal belonging, to assert dominance, all these subtle ways of negotiating group boundaries.
It's like even on a subconscious level, we're using language to reinforce those in-group and out-group distinctions.
And what this study highlighted was how those dynamics played out in a workplace setting, impacting communication, teamwork, even things like decision-making.
It's amazing how a theory originally developed to understand prejudice can then be applied to something like understanding communication patterns in a multinational company.
Right. It just goes to show how deeply group membership is embedded in all these different aspects of our lives, from our personal relationships to the workplace and even our political views. It really affects how we think, feel, and act.
It's almost like a hidden force shaping so much of our behavior, but once you understand it, you start to see it everywhere.
Exactly. And that's why SIT is such an important and enduring theory.
It gives us this new lens to understand the world. Well, I'm already feeling like I've learned a ton. We're just getting started.
Now, like any good theory, SIT has its share of criticisms. It's not perfect.
Right. No theory is. So what are some of the main critiques of SIT? Where does it fall short?
Well, one of the big ones is that some researchers feel it focuses a bit too much on conflict between groups, that us versus them dynamic.
Makes sense. It's called social identity theory, so identity and groups are front and center.
Exactly. But the criticism is that it doesn't always pay enough attention to how those identities are formed and maintained within groups.
So it's looking at the clashes between groups, but not really getting into the nitty-gritty of what's happening inside each group.
You could say that. It's like it's missing part of the picture. There's a whole internal world to groups that SIT, at least in its early forms, didn't really address.
That's a good point. Groups aren't just these monolithic entities. They're made up of individuals with their own experiences and perspectives.
Precisely. And thankfully, newer research is starting to build upon SIT's foundation, trying to address some of these gaps.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of the ways researchers are expanding on the original theory?
Well, one really interesting area is the role of emotions.
Ah, so moving beyond just the cognitive, the thinking part of how we categorize and relate to groups.
Exactly, because early SIT was very focused on those cognitive processes, how we categorize, how we compare groups, things like that.
But we know our feelings play a huge role in how we see the world and interact with others, especially when it comes to group dynamics.
Absolutely. Feelings like fear, anger, pride, shame, they can all really fuel those intergroup dynamics.
So researchers are digging into how emotions shape our social identities and our interactions with other groups.
Yep. It's a fascinating area of research, and it's adding a lot of nuance to our understanding of SIT.
It makes sense. It's not just cold, hard logic that's driving these intergroup dynamics. Our feelings about our group and about others really fuel our actions. What else? What other new directions are researchers taking with SIT?
Another exciting area is research on leadership within groups.
Ah, that's interesting. Leaders have such a big impact on shaping a group's norms, values, even behaviors.
Exactly. And what some researchers are exploring is how those ideas of social identity, those in-group and out-group dynamics, play out in the context of leadership.
So, like, how does a leader's social identity affect their leadership style, or how the group responds to them?
All of that. But one particularly interesting finding has to do with the idea of prototypicality.
Prototypicality. Okay, break that down for me.
So basically, it's about how much a leader embodies the key characteristics of their group. They're seen as a true representative of what it means to be a member.
So it's not just about being charismatic or a good speaker. It's about reflecting the group's identity back to them.
Precisely. And the research shows that the more prototypical a leader is, the more influence they have within the group. They're seen as more credible, more trustworthy, more likely to act in the group's best interest.
That's fascinating. It's like their social identity gives them extra authority.
It's like they've earned the right to speak for the group. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Prototypical leaders, because they're so trusted by the group, they can actually get away with deviating from group norms more.
Really? So they have more leeway to challenge the status quo, to push for change.
Exactly. They're seen as acting in the group's best interest, even if they're pushing boundaries.
That's cool. It's like they have more freedom to rock the boat a bit because they so clearly embody what the group is all about.
And this research on leadership also ties into another important aspect of SIT, which is the idea that we don't just belong to one group. We're all members of multiple groups.
So true. I mean, I'm a parent, a teacher, a member of my community, a music fan. All these different groups are part of who I am.
And those different group memberships, they can overlap, they can sometimes even conflict.
Absolutely. And depending on the situation, one of those identities might become more salient, more important than others.
That's exactly what SIT helps us understand, how those different group memberships become more or less prominent depending on the context.
So like at a concert, my identity as a music fan might be front and center, but at a parent-teacher meeting, it's my identity as a parent that takes over.
Exactly. Understanding how those different group memberships interact, how they become more or less salient, it's key to understanding all sorts of social phenomena. It affects how we form opinions, make decisions, relate to others. It even plays a role in how we cope with stress and adversity.
Wow. It's like we're constantly juggling all these different parts of ourselves, and the situation determines which one takes the lead. It makes me think about all the talk these days about diversity and inclusion. Is there a connection to SIT there?
Absolutely. In fact, SIT provides a really powerful framework for understanding the complexities of diversity and inclusion.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, for starters, SIT acknowledges that people's group memberships shape their experiences, their perspectives, their values.
So recognizing that people come from different backgrounds, different social groups, and that those differences inform how they see the world and interact with it.
Exactly. And inclusion, in this context, is about creating spaces where individuals feel safe and valued, regardless of their group memberships.
It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong, that they can bring their whole selves to the table without fear of judgment or exclusion.
And what's really powerful is that SAT can also give us tools to improve relations between groups.
Because if we understand those underlying dynamics of social identity, we can start to break down those us versus them barriers that cause so much conflict.
Exactly. We can start to build more understanding, more empathy, more compassion.
It's about finding that common ground, that shared humanity, even when we acknowledge and respect our differences.
Well said. And by fostering a sense of shared identity, we can create more cohesive and collaborative communities.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm feeling like I'm seeing the world in a whole new light. So as we start to wrap up our deep dive into social identity theory, I want to bring it back to the big picture. What are the most important things we want our listeners to take away from all of this? What makes SIT such an important and influential theory?
Well, I think first and foremost, SIT just highlights how much being part of a group shapes who we are and how we behave. It's not just about our individual personalities or experiences, it's about those social identities we carry with us.
That sense of belonging, of shared identity, it's a powerful force in our lives.
It really is.
Yeah.
And SIT also reminds us that context matters. The importance of our different group identities can shift depending on the situation, the people we're with, the goals we're trying to achieve.
It's like we have all these different parts of ourselves, and depending on what's happening around us, one part might come to the forefront while others recede into the background.
Exactly. And finally, I think SIT underscores the fact that we all belong to multiple groups, and those different memberships, they create both opportunities and challenges.
They enrich our lives, but they can also lead to conflict and division.
And that's why it's so important to find ways to bridge those divides, to foster understanding and create more inclusive and equitable spaces.
Well said. SIT really gives us a framework for understanding how complex human interactions really are. And it feels especially relevant today, with so much talk about identity, belonging, and conflict between groups.
Absolutely. SIT gives us tools not just to understand those dynamics, but to hopefully find ways to navigate them more effectively, to build a more just and compassionate world.
Well, that's a great note to end on, but we're not quite done yet. We have one more part to this deep dive, where we'll explore how SIT can be applied to your own life. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with social identity theory, from its origins to its strengths and weaknesses, and even some of the new directions research is taking. But now, I want to bring it back to you, our listener. How can you use this knowledge in your own life?
That's a great question. I think one of the most valuable things you can do is take some time to reflect on your own social identities.
So, like thinking about the different groups we belong to, how those memberships shape how we see the world.
Exactly. Think about your family, your profession, your community, your cultural or ethnic background, any groups that are important to you. And then ask yourself, how do those memberships influence your values, your beliefs, the way you see yourself and others?
It's almost like putting on different lenses, right? Depending on the situation, one of those group identities might come into focus, and that changes how we interpret what's happening around us.
You got it. And sometimes those different lenses might clash, creating internal conflict or making us question our own values.
Yeah, like when the values of one group we belong to are at odds with the values of another group. That can be tough to navigate.
It can be. But the more aware we are of these dynamics, the more we understand the power of social identity, the better equipped we are to navigate those complexities with more intention and understanding.
So instead of just reacting on autopilot, we can take a step back and say, okay, what's going on here? What are my different group memberships and how are they influencing my perspective?
Right. We can start to see those us versus them categorizations as they pop up and hopefully challenge them.
Remind ourselves to look for common ground, to remember that shared humanity that connects us all.
Well said. And who knows, maybe once you start thinking about SIT, you'll start seeing it everywhere.
Like in our everyday interactions, in the news, even in our own internal monologues.
It's true. Social identity is all around us. It's this invisible force shaping so much of our behavior.
But once we make it visible, once we understand how it works, we can start to harness this power for good.
Absolutely. We can use it to build stronger relationships, to create more inclusive communities, and to promote greater understanding across differences.
I love that. It's like instead of being controlled by social identity, we can learn to use it as a tool for positive change.
Well, I think it's been a fantastic place to wrap up our deep dive on social identity theory.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise. And a huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this journey. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Until next time, keep those mental gears turning.